Laura is a young woman who leads a peaceful, though sometimes lonely life. One day she receives a mysterious guest. It is Carmilla, whose hypnotic beauty and enigmatic charm stir both fascination and unease, awakening memories of a childhood terror Laura has never forgotten. As unexplained deaths haunt the region and a supernatural aura lingers in the air, Carmilla seems intensely drawn to her new friend, while Laura grows increasingly tormented by something dark she cannot understand. Some companions are as seductive as they are deadly. Who is Carmilla, and what does this woman truly desire?
You are mine. You shall be mine. You and I are one forever.
Laura lives with her father. They reside in Styria, a region of Austria, in a castle. They are English. Her father served in the Austrian army. When he retired, he bought this picturesque estate for a very low price. The castle has a drawbridge, a moat, towers, and a Gothic chapel. The path leading from the castle gate stretches into a dark, lonely forest. The nearest inhabited village is about 7 miles away. Her father's friend, General Spielsdorf, lives 20 miles in the opposite direction. About 3 miles away, there's a ruined village with a small church, and between them lie the tombs of the Karnstein family. Besides her father, the servants, and the estate's dependents, Laura lives with few people: Madame Perrodon and Mademoiselle de La Fontaine, her governesses. Her mother died when she was a baby. From time to time, Laura's friends visit, or neighbors come to stay for a while. Laura's earliest clear memory is terrifying. When she was about 6 and sleeping in the nursery, she woke in the middle of the night. Her nurse was not there, but she wasn't scared, as she had never heard ghost stories or fairy tales. She was annoyed at being neglected and began to whimper. A moment later, she saw the face of a beautiful girl on the other side of the bed. The girl smiled, lay down beside her, and caressed her. Laura fell asleep but woke with the sensation of 2 needles piercing her chest. She screamed loudly and the woman dove under the bed. Household members heard her scream and rushed into the room. The governess whispered, frightened, that there was a warm spot in the bed next to Laura. There was no visible sign of a puncture. After that, someone slept in Laura's room with her until she turned 14. She became very nervous and couldn't bear to be alone for long after the incident. Her father said it was a dream, but she knew it wasn't. She remembers how an old man in a cassock came to her room and said prayers she sometimes repeated. Laura forgot her life before that incident, and for some time afterward, everything was obscure too. But the scenes of the event stand out vividly, like the isolated images of a phantasmagoria surrounded by darkness. Laura and her father are taking a pleasant walk through the woods. He regretfully informs her that General Spielsdorf won't be visiting. This deeply upsets Laura, as the general was to bring his niece and ward, Mademoiselle Bertha Reinfeldt, and Laura was eager to spend a few weeks with this young woman, said to be kind and charming. She asks her father when they'll come, and he initially says he's glad she hasn't met the girl. Laura asks why, and he says it's because she's dead. Her father sighs and pulls a letter from his pocket, and they sit on a bench. The letter is extraordinary and strange, passionate, and at times contradictory. Laura doesn't grasp it immediately. In it, the general says Mademoiselle Reinfeldt died innocent, but he's aware of the demonic creature he welcomed into his home and what it did to his Bertha. He plans to spend the rest of his life hunting this cursed creature until he destroys it. He's consumed by grief and confusion, but knows what he must do. Laura and her father walk slowly back to the castle, reflecting on the letter's meaning. As they approach the drawbridge under the moonlight, they see the governesses, who have stepped out to enjoy the evening. Over the ground, a thin film of mist spread like smoke, and no softer or sweeter scene could be imagined. The news casts a melancholic air, yet the atmosphere remains serene. Madame de La Fontaine, regarded as psychological, metaphysical, and somewhat mystical, remarks dreamily that when the moon shines like this, it's a sign of special spiritual activity. She says the night is full of idyllic and magnetic influence. Laura's father says he doesn't feel well that night and senses a misfortune looming over them. Suddenly, the sound of carriage wheels and horses' hooves grabs everyone's attention. A carriage with 2 coachmen appears, with 2 passengers behind. The horses are galloping wildly, out of control, and screams echo from inside the carriage. Laura realizes an accident is imminent and looks away. When she opens her eyes, she sees 2 horses fallen on the ground, the carriage tipped on its side, and an elegant lady standing outside wiping her eyes. Laura watches as some men pull a young woman from the carriage, and her father goes to comfort the lady. He checks the girl's pulse and declares she's not dead. The woman who says she's her mother rejoices. The elegant lady asks where the nearest village is and laments being on an urgent journey, saying she must leave her daughter there to continue quickly. Laura whispers to her father, asking if they can invite the girl to stay with them. Her father extends the invitation, and the woman says she wouldn't want to impose. He insists it's no trouble, and that leaving her at an inn wouldn't be wise. The lady sees the carriage is ready to continue and casts a strange look at her daughter. She pulls Laura's father aside and speaks to him quietly, then approaches and whispers something to her daughter. A moment later, she departs. The young woman opens her eyes and asks where her mother is. Then she wonders where she herself is, and Madame Perrodon, reassuringly, explains what's happening. Madame escorts her into the castle. Meanwhile, Laura's father has already sent for the doctor. Laura is told she can't speak to the girl yet, for fear of overexciting her. They settle the young woman in her room and retire to the elegant drawing room. Laura, eager, asks Madame what she thinks of the guest, and Madame replies that she's the most beautiful creature she's ever seen, very kind and amiable. Mademoiselle de La Fontaine agrees, and then asks if anyone saw the other woman in the carriage. No one did, and she explains she was old, hideous, dark, with gleaming eyes and a furious expression. Madame remarks that all the men seem ragged too. Everyone agrees they were sullen, thin, and had a roguish air. Later, when Laura and her father are alone, she begs to know what the old lady said to him. He reveals that the woman said her daughter was frail but perfectly sane, even if her behavior might seem odd. She said she'd return in 3 months and that her daughter wouldn't reveal anything about who they were or what they were doing. Laura's father admits the woman seems strange with all the secrecy, but Laura doesn't mind. She's happy the girl is there. Late that night, the doctor arrives and reports from downstairs that the girl is fine and uninjured. He says it's now possible to see her. Laura goes up to the beautifully decorated candlelit room, but when she sees the guest, she's shocked. It's the same girl from the incident when she was 6. She's feared that face for 12 years, and now it's right before her. The girl is silent for a moment, then smiles in recognition. She approaches and says that 12 years ago, she saw Laura's face in a dream and never forgot it. A strange glint flickers in her eyes for a moment and vanishes, leaving Laura comforted. She firmly grasps the girl's hand, and the girl returns a smile. The young woman then shares her own vision from 12 years ago. She says she was also 6 and woke in an unfamiliar place. There she saw Laura, just as she is now, and her beauty comforted her. She lay beside Laura but woke to her screams and was frightened. She fell to the floor, and upon waking, was back in her nursery. After Laura shares her version of the story, the girl smiles warmly and says it seems they were destined to be friends. Laura feels drawn to her, but deep down also feels a slight repulsion mixed with the attraction. However, the attraction prevails for now. Laura notices the girl seems tired and suggests she rest. The girl agrees, explaining she can't sleep with someone in the room and fears thieves, so she'll lock the door. She embraces Laura warmly, saying she's eager to see her the next day. Then she lies down on the pillow. Laura feels flattered but slightly confused by such attention and trust from the girl. The next day they meet again, and Laura is charmed by her new friend's company, whose name she learns is Carmilla. Laura thinks she's the most beautiful girl she's ever seen. They laugh together about the horrors they felt toward each other in the past. Carmilla is slender and graceful, with a beautiful complexion, dark eyes, and thick, lustrous hair. She speaks in a low voice and moves languidly. However, some things about Carmilla bother Laura, like her refusal to share the truth about her situation, despite seeming so trusting on the first night. There's also a coldness and an air of antiquity about her. All Carmilla reveals is her name, that she comes from an ancient and noble family, and that her home is in the West. Laura occasionally tries to learn more, but always fails, though she's usually soothed by her new friend's sweetness. Carmilla is prone to sudden outbursts of affection, including kisses on Laura's cheek, tight embraces, and constant compliments. This is a bit much for Laura, who often wants to pull away, but Carmilla seems to put her in a trance. These are the moments Laura doesn't enjoy, when her excitement mingles with fear. She feels conscious of a love growing into adoration, and also of repulsion. Sometimes, after long moments of apathy, Carmilla would hold Laura's hand with a gentle, steady pressure, as if to reaffirm her affection at every moment. Carmilla blushed faintly, her eyes casting languid and warm glances at Laura's face, while her quickened breathing made her dress rise and fall, reflecting the intensity of her feelings. There was the ardor of a lover there, a mixture of embarrassment and irresistible attraction that overwhelmed Laura. With a look of triumph, Carmilla drew her close, her warm lips tracing soft kisses along Laura's face. In a nearly trembling whisper, she said, "You are mine. You must be mine. We will be together forever." Then, as if overcome by her own emotions, she leaned back in the chair, covering her eyes with delicate hands, leaving Laura trembling before that intense and overwhelming display. When Laura asks what this means, Carmilla only sighs and turns away. Laura questions these behaviors, recalling her father's mention that the old woman said Carmilla wasn't mad. She knows she lacks the small attentions that masculine gallantry delights in offering. And sometimes between these passionate moments, Carmilla barely seems to notice her. Other habits are odd, like Carmilla not coming downstairs until at least 1 in the afternoon. She drinks a cup of chocolate, but eats nothing. Then she takes a short walk and returns exhausted. There's a bodily languor with which her mind seems to sympathize, and she loves to talk. One day a funeral procession passes while the girls sit among the trees. The peasants sing a hymn, and Carmilla says she finds it dissonant. Laura feels uneasy with this blunt remark and starts singing along. Carmilla gets irritated, saying her religion and Laura's aren't the same, and that those songs hurt her. She adds that everyone is happier after death, and these funerals are ridiculous. Laura, surprised, replies that it's the funeral of a local peasant girl who reportedly saw a ghost 2 weeks ago and has been wasting away since. Carmilla doesn't want to hear more. Laura continues, mentioning that the pig farmer's young wife also died the previous week, after reporting something grabbing her throat and strangling her in bed. Carmilla merely sighs and remarks that at least her funeral and hymns are over. The two draw closer. Suddenly, Carmilla's expression turns alarmed, and she begins trembling uncontrollably. It seems like a hysterical fit, but soon passes, along with her anger. Laura had never seen such reactions in her friend before. Another day, they spot a hunchback crossing the drawbridge. He's known to Laura and her father and carries all sorts of items. He brings oddities and figures stitched from parts of dead animals. He has a dog as a companion, which refuses to approach the castle. The charlatan bows to the ladies at the window and plays a tune on his violin. Then he announces what he sells and what he can do. He offers amulets against the upir, a type of vampire, said to haunt the region. They're made of parchment with Kabbalistic ciphers and diagrams. Carmilla buys one immediately and Laura does too. The hunchback looks closely at Carmilla and pulls steel instruments from his leather case. Smiling, he says she has a very sharp tooth and offers to file it down. Carmilla flies into a rage and retreats from the window. That night, Laura's father is downcast. He tells the ladies about another case like the previous ones and says these poor people are infected by superstitions and repeat in their imagination the images of terror that have infested their neighbors. Carmilla remarks that she's afraid, and Laura's father replies that they're all in God's hands and he will care for them. Carmilla only says the disease sweeping the region is natural and everything comes from nature. Laura's father falls silent, then says the doctor will come to examine them. Carmilla grumbles that doctors have only done more harm than good. She won't say more. When Laura and Carmilla leave the room, Carmilla complains that Laura's father is trying to scare them. Laura says he isn't, and that he, like her, is afraid. Carmilla claims she sees nothing frightening and says it's wonderful when two lovers die together. The next day, the doctor arrives and consults privately with Laura's father. They leave the room. Laura's father is laughing, and the doctor smiles and shakes his head, saying, "Still, life and death are mysterious states, and we know little about the resources of either." Laura doesn't understand what he meant, but has a hunch. That night, the son of the picture restorer from Graz arrives, bringing the portrait sent some time ago for restoration. Everyone in the house is excited, though Carmilla remains apathetic. The portraits are unpacked, most of them belonging to Laura's Hungarian mother's family. The portraits are very old and some quite curious. Laura's father pulls out one inscribed Marcia Karnstein, dated 1698. It's very small but has a striking effect on the group, as it looks exactly like Carmilla. Laura asks if she can hang it in her room, and her father agrees. Carmilla watches her with a smile. Laura looks closer and says it's not Marcia, but Mircalla, Countess Karnstein, and notes that her mother was descended from the Karnsteins. Carmilla remarks that she must be from the same family then, and asks if anyone with that name is still alive. Laura replies no, but says the ruins of the family's castle are just 3 miles away. Carmilla changes the subject, asking if they can take a moonlight stroll. The two go out and walk pleasantly. Carmilla asks if Laura is happy she came, and when Laura says yes, Carmilla says how pleased she is that Laura chose to hang the portrait in her room. She finds it very romantic. Laura remarks that Carmilla's story does seem like a romantic tale, and that it feels like she's living a love affair right now. Carmilla whispers that she's never been in love with anyone, but if she were, it would be Laura. She then says she lives in Laura and loves her deeply. Laura is startled by this, but Carmilla's face is now pale and serene. She seems a bit weak, and Laura suggests they go back inside. Carmilla sighs, saying it might be the last time they're together under the moonlight, making Laura wonder if she's ill. Carmilla shakes her head and says she's fine. She's always a bit weak and languid, but always recovers. For the rest of the evening, they talk normally, and Carmilla shows none of her sudden passions, as Laura calls them. The ladies sit with the governesses, drinking chocolate and coffee. Laura's father enters and asks Carmilla if she's heard from her mother. Carmilla says no. He then asks where a letter could be sent, and she says she doesn't know. Carmilla then remarks that she's been thinking of leaving, as she feels she's caused too much trouble for the family. Laura's father says that's not true, and they can't lose her. Laura is relieved to hear this. Her father explains he asked because he's worried about this mysterious illness and feels responsible for notifying Carmilla's mother. Later, Laura accompanies Carmilla upstairs and asks if she'll ever fully trust her. Carmilla just smiles and finally says she's under vows and can't tell her story to anyone. The time will come soon, and Laura will know everything. She must understand that love is always selfish. Carmilla then asks if Laura has ever been to a ball and says she herself went to one many years ago, which strikes Laura as odd. Carmilla recalls everything, especially nearly being murdered in her bed. She was wounded in her breast as a result of a cruel love, which should remind Laura that love will have its sacrifices. No sacrifice without blood. Upon saying this, the two bid each other good night. Laura often wonders if Carmilla prays. She's never seen her pray but heard she was baptized. She never talks about religion. Carmilla continues locking her bedroom door, and Laura begins copying this habit. One night, she has a dream that was the beginning of a very strange agony. She's aware she's sleeping and in her room, and also senses what's happening. The room is dark, and something is moving at the foot of the bed. It's a monstrous creature, cat-like, pacing back and forth as if in a cage. Laura is terrified, especially as the room grows darker. The creature approaches and pierces her with two sharp points. Laura screams and sees a female figure standing by the bed. She's completely still but shifts positions until she vanishes. Laura wonders if Carmilla played some kind of prank, but her door is still locked from the inside. The night is dreadful for Laura, and her terror seems to deepen over time. However, she doesn't tell her father, fearing she'll alarm him or he'll laugh at her. Sitting with Madame and Mademoiselle, Laura shares her concerns. Mademoiselle remarks that the path under the lime trees outside Carmilla's window is haunted, as Martin, who was fixing a gate nearby, saw a figure climbing the alley. She adds that Martin was very frightened. Laura asks them not to tell Carmilla, as it would scare her too much. Later, Carmilla comes down and tells Laura she was quite frightened the previous night because something was in her room. Fortunately, she adds, she had her amulet with her. Laura then shares her own experience from the night before, and Carmilla asks if she had her amulet. Laura says no, but retrieves it and places it on her pillow. That night and the next, Laura sleeps well, but a lustrous feeling of languor and melancholy overtakes her. Carmilla is pleased to hear this and comments that she believes fevers or other illnesses pass nearby, but the amulet keeps them at bay. She thinks these ailments try to attack the nerves to reach the brain, but the antidote repels them. Laura privately isn't so sure. Every morning, Laura continues to wake with this strange languor and melancholy. She begins to feel like a different person. She has dark thoughts about death, tinged with a sad yet sweet tone. She doesn't mention anything to her father. Carmilla grows more devoted to her, and disturbingly, seemed to revel with increasing fervor as Laura's strength and spirit waned. Laura doesn't yet know, but she's progressing through a strange illness. The initial symptoms are fascinating, but they soon take on a terrifying hue, and her entire life feels altered and corrupted. She experiences vague, indecipherable sensations during sleep, along with visions that leave her exhausted by morning. Upon waking, she feels as if she'd been somewhere dark, talking to people she can't see. Sometimes she feels a hand on her face or a warm kiss. Laura feels suffocated, convulses, and faints. This lasts for 3 weeks. Laura's appearance changes, and her father asks if she's all right. She always reassures him and, indeed, has no physical symptoms. What she suffers from are her imagination and nerves. She doesn't believe it's the upire, as villagers said it kills in a few days, and she's been this way for a long time. Carmilla also complains of similar dreams and sensations, though less intense. In hindsight, Laura regrets not thinking to pray for help, as her thoughts were dulled. One night, Laura hears a clear, cruel voice, her mother's, warning her about the assassin. A light flares, revealing Carmilla, drenched in blood, at the foot of her bed. Laura screams and leaps from bed, worried for Carmilla. She runs to the door and pounds loudly. Mademoiselle and Madame join her, but there's no response. Eventually, servants come running, and Laura orders them to force the lock. When they open the door, they see Carmilla isn't in the room, and nothing seems disturbed. Laura, Madame, and Mademoiselle calm down a bit. Mademoiselle suggests Carmilla might be hiding, frightened, but they search the room thoroughly and find she's really gone. Laura is utterly confused about how Carmilla could have left with the door locked from the inside. At dawn, the entire household is in alarm. There's no sign of Carmilla, and Laura's father is horrified at the thought of having to find a way to tell her mother. Around 1 in the afternoon, Laura goes up to Carmilla's room and finds her standing inside the room. Laura sighs in relief and runs to her, embracing and covering her with kisses in ecstasy. She exclaims that everyone was so worried and asks where she'd been. Carmilla replies that she had a very strange night, as she woke on the dressing room sofa with the doors unlocked, with no memory of moving there. By now, the others have come upstairs too and shower Carmilla with expressions of relief and gratitude for her return. Laura's father paces the room, and Carmilla watches him with a sly look. He asks Carmilla to sit and says he thinks she might have been sleepwalking and asks if she thinks that's possible. She admits she did so as a child. Laura's father smiles and says that must be the explanation. He comments that he wishes all mysteries were as easily and innocently explained as this one of Carmilla's. Carmilla looks as languid and charming as ever, and Laura's father sighs, wishing Laura looked as well as she used to. Carmilla refuses to have a companion in her room, so a servant sleeps outside her door at night. The night passes normally. The next day, the doctor comes to see Laura. As she tells her story, he grows increasingly serious. He asks for Laura's father to join them. The two talk gravely for a while Madame Perrodon and Laura burn with curiosity. Finally, Laura's father calls her, and she feels a bit apprehensive. He asks her to tell Dr. Spielsdorf about the sensation of 2 needle pricks on her skin and if there's any pain. She says no. The doctor asks her to point to where she was pricked, and she indicates just below her throat. He then asks her to pull back the fabric covering the area, and both he and Laura's father gasp. Laura asks what's wrong, and the doctor points to a small blue mark. Dr. Spielsdorf turns to Laura's father, who's pale, and says not to worry, as Laura will start improving soon. He calls Madame and says she must not leave Laura alone for a minute. Madame agrees. Laura's father asks the doctor if he could examine Carmilla too, as she has a milder version of Laura's symptoms. He says she'll come down later and hopes the doctor will join them for lunch. The doctor says she'll return for it. Laura watches from the window as her father sees Dr. Spielsdorf off. He mounts his horse and leaves. At the same time, the mail arrives. Within half an hour, Laura's father appears with a letter from General Spielsdorf, saying he's delayed but should arrive soon. Laura notices her father is worried and asks if the doctor thinks she's very ill. He says no, and that with the right care, she'll recover fully. He just wishes General Spielsdorf were coming at another time. Laura presses to know what's wrong with her, but her father refuses to say. Laura's father leaves but returns a moment later to say he's going to Karnstein to see the priest, and that she and Madame must come along. Carmilla can follow later with Mademoiselle when she comes down. Around noon, they set off down the tree-lined road to Karnstein. The scenery is pleasant and tranquil. To their surprise, they meet the general on the way. He joins the carriage and sends his horse to the castle. The general looks very different from 10 months ago. He's thinner, and his face shows sadness, anxiety, and notably, anger. After a few minutes in the carriage, he begins to speak. He's consumed by bitterness and rage against the demon that destroyed his niece and wonders how heaven can allow it. Laura's father asks if he could share the details with them, but the general says they won't believe him. Laura's father replies that he's not as skeptical as he might seem and trusts the general. The general sighs and says he was made a fool by a supernatural conspiracy. At this, Laura's father looks a bit concerned, but the general just stares melancholically out at the forest through the window. The general asks if they're going to Karnstein and if there's still a ruined chapel with many tombs of that extinct family. Laura's father confirms and jokingly asks if he wants to claim the title and lands. Without a smile, the general replies that he intends to dig up some people there, and with God's blessing, commit a pious sacrilege that will rid our land of certain monsters. Laura's father remarks that the Karnstein line has been extinct for a long time, and though his wife was descended from them, the name and title no longer exist. The general says he knows this, but wants to tell his story in the order events happened. He begins by saying how dear his niece was to him. Tears fill his eyes. He knows he may not have much time left, but hopes to achieve his revenge. The carriage approaches the road to Karnstein, and Laura's father encourages the general to begin his story. Bertha was thrilled about visiting Laura, and in the meantime, she and the general were visiting his friend, Count Karlsfeld, to attend a series of parties. One night, there's a magnificent masquerade ball, and all the gardens are illuminated. It's unlike anything seen, even in Paris. There's wonderful music, soft voices, and beautiful fireworks. The ball begins after the fireworks, and Bertha, unmasked, watches everything with delight. Another young woman, elegantly dressed and wearing a mask, observes her with interest. An older woman, also finely dressed with an imposing air, accompanies the young woman. After dancing, Bertha rests and the general stays nearby. The masked young woman sits beside Bertha. The older woman starts talking to the general, mentioning details of his life he'd nearly forgotten. He doesn't know where he knows her from, and she seems amused by his confusion. Meanwhile, the young woman talks to Bertha, speaking like an old friend, full of compliments and wit. She lowers her mask, revealing a charming face. The general asks the older woman to do him a favor and remove her mask, but she laughs and says he's not wearing one, so it wouldn't be fair. She points to the young woman and says she's her daughter, Mircalla, which means she herself can't be young anymore. The general asks other questions, but she skillfully avoids giving clear answers. At one point, she's interrupted by an elegant man dressed in black with a face pale as death. He's unmasked. He leans in and asks if he can speak with her. She agrees and they step aside to talk seriously. The general keeps wondering where he knows this woman from. Soon after, she and the man return. The man says he'll inform Madame la Comtesse when the carriage is at the door, then withdraws. The older woman asks if the general has recognized her yet, and when he says no, she explains they're old friends, perhaps closer than he realizes. But she can't reveal herself yet. She says she's received shocking news and must leave immediately. She then makes a singular request. She explains that her daughter's nerves prevent her from riding a horse right now, as her animal recently fell during a hunt, and she has nowhere to go. So she makes an extraordinary request, that her daughter stay with him. She had practically disarmed the general by highlighting all the misfortunes that could result from his refusal, while placing all her trust solely in his chivalry. At that moment, Bertha approaches and asks if Mircalla can stay with them, and the two beautiful young women press him together. Mircalla's engaging charm captivates him, and he agrees. The countess calls her daughter and tells her, within earshot of the others, that the general is an old and dear friend. As they leave, the woman begs the general not to try to learn more about her until she returns. Her daughter will keep the same secret. She whispers something to her daughter, kisses her, and hurries away. Mircalla goes to the window to watch her mother leave. She sighs when she notices her mother doesn't look back. Her lovely face moves the general, who feels bad for being curt earlier. The general, Bertha, and Mircalla stroll through the gardens by moonlight. Mircalla is utterly charming, entertaining both of them. The general grows fonder of her. When it's time to leave, Mircalla gets lost in the bustling crowds in the vast gardens. The general begins to despair, unable to understand how he could be so foolish as to take responsibility for someone he didn't know. He and Bertha retire to their quarters in the Grand Duke's house, wondering how they'll return home without Mircalla. Fortunately, around 2 in the afternoon that same day, Mircalla appears, explaining that she lost sight of them and was distressed, so she waited in one of the governess's rooms and fell asleep. They're relieved to have her back and set off for the general's castle. The general continues his story. He says there are notable things about Mircalla, like her languor, locking her bedroom door from the inside, and the possibility of sleepwalking. Meanwhile, his niece also seems to fall ill, losing her beauty and health. She has terrifying dreams and distressing sensations, like needle pricks below her throat and suffocation. As the general recounts this, Laura listens and finds it very strange, as she's had similar experiences and notices Mircalla shares many traits with Carmilla. The carriage emerges into a clearing, and suddenly they're under the chimneys and gables of a ruined village, along with the tower and battlements of the destroyed castle. The three step out of the carriage and walk silently through the castle's corridors and chambers. The general remarks aloud that this is the Karnstein castle, whose family continues to haunt the world after death with their atrocious desires. The general points to a chapel among the trees below and says he hears a woodcutter, who might provide more information and point out Mircalla, Countess Karnstein's tomb. Laura's father says there's a portrait of her at their house if he wants to see it, but the general replies grimly that he believes he's already seen her in person. Laura's father is incredulous, but says nothing. The three walk under the Gothic church's arch, and the general reaffirms that his sole purpose in life now is to avenge himself on Mircalla. He openly declares he intends to behead the monster with whatever tool he has, a hatchet, a shovel, anything. The general suggests they sit as Laura looks tired, so he can continue his story. They settle down and the general calls the woodcutter, who approaches. The man knows little about the monuments, but says there's a forester staying with the priest who can point out the Karnstein monument. He offers to take their horse and fetch him. Before he leaves, Laura's father asks how the village became deserted. The woodcutter explains it was plagued by revenants that had to be tracked to their graves and exterminated by beheading and burning. But many villagers died before this was done. Even after many vampires were destroyed, the village remained troubled. A Moravian nobleman was traveling through the region and heard what was happening. He decided to help and, on a clear moonlit night, climbed the chapel's tower from where he could see the graveyard below. He watched until he saw a vampire emerge from his tomb and glide away. He then went to the tomb, took the creature's linen garments back to the tower. The vampire returned, howling for its clothes. The Moravian called it to the tower, and as the vampire climbed the stairs, he split its skull and sent it tumbling down. Then he beheaded it, and the villagers staked and burned the body. The noble had authority to move Mircalla's tomb, but the new location was forgotten. At the end of the story, the woodcutter says he doesn't know where that location is, but that it's said Mircalla's body was also removed. The woodcutter departs. The general continues his account, saying his niece grows worse, and the doctor can do nothing for her, so he calls a more skilled one, Dr. Gratz. The two doctors argue, and when the general confronts them, Dr. Gratz stands firm, even in the face of the other doctor's mockery. The first doctor scoffs, saying it seems Dr. Gratz thinks they need a sorcerer, not a physician. The general steps out to his castle's gardens, distracted. Dr. Gratz catches up and says he can't leave without sharing his concerns. He explains it's not a natural illness and that death is very near, within a day or two, if something drastic isn't done. When the general presses for more, the doctor says he's put everything in a letter. He insists the general take it to the priest and read it only in his presence, also summoning another learned man on the subject covered in the letter. The general finds the priest absent, so he reads the letter alone. He's shocked to see that the patient is being attacked by a vampire, with no doubt given the descriptions and the wound. The general is a skeptic, but is so desperate he decides to follow the letter's instructions. It orders him to go to his niece's dressing room and watch her at night while she sleeps. He does so and sees a large dark creature crawling toward Bertha, and, as it nears her neck, swelling into a mass. The general is petrified but advances with his sword. The creature contracts and he glimpses Mircalla. He strikes at her, but she rematerializes near the door and vanishes. The house descends into chaos. Mircalla disappears, and Bertha dies in the morning. Laura and her father listen to this sad story. Laura's father stands up and walks among the graves. The general sighs. In that abandoned and sinister place, after hearing the general's account, Laura begins to feel a growing sense of horror. Then she feels immensely relieved when she sees Carmilla in the distance, entering the chapel. However, at that moment, the general rises and grabs the woodcutter's axe. When Carmilla sees him, a terrible and wild expression takes over her face. He charges at her, but she dodges the blow and grabs his wrist, making him drop the axe. He stumbles back, and she vanishes. A moment later, Laura snaps out of her confusion and hears Madame Perrodon asking where Carmilla is. Laura points to the door, but Madame says no. She's been standing there the whole time. Madame calls Carmilla, but there's no answer. When the general hears this, he declares that Carmilla is Mircalla, who is the same person as Mircalla, Countess Karnstein. He insists they go immediately to the clergyman's house and not leave. Before Laura can do anything, a strange-looking man enters. He's tall, stooped, dressed in black, with a wrinkled, swarthy face, an odd, shuffling gait, and wears gold-rimmed glasses. The general steps forward cheerfully, greeting him as the Baron. When Laura's father returns, he makes introductions. Baron Vordenberg has a plan of the chapel and consults a tattered little book. He measures the space, leads the men to a side wall, and clears the ivy covering a large marble slab. The woodcutter returns and helps them confirm the resting place of Mircalla, Countess Karnstein. The general looks to the heavens and declares that the commissioner will arrive tomorrow, and the Inquisition will proceed according to the law. He then warmly shakes the Baron's hand, saying he's freed them from a plague. Laura's father and the general speak quietly with the Baron, and Laura knows they're discussing her case. Laura's father approaches her and says that before they return home, they must include the priest in their party. This is easily done, and they return to the castle. Laura is saddened that there's no trace of Carmilla. That night, 2 servants and Madame stay in Laura's room, with the priest and her father in the adjacent dressing room. The priest performs solemn rituals that night, which Laura doesn't understand. Curiously, however, Carmilla's absence also ends Laura's nightly torments. The next day, formal proceedings take place at the Karnstein chapel. The tomb is opened, and the general and Laura's father recognize Carmilla's face. Despite 150 years having passed, her features are warm, her eyes open, and the coffin emits no cadaverous odor. 2 doctors present confirmed signs of breathing and a heartbeat. Her limbs are flexible. The lead coffin was filled with blood, in which the body was submerged. A stake is driven through her heart, and the woman lets out a scream. They cut off her head and burn the body until it turns to ashes, which are then thrown into the river. No vampire has haunted the region since. Laura's father has a report from the Imperial Commission, signed by all present. Though Laura says she recounts all this with composure, she's still haunted and shaken by these memories. The days and nights after her deliverance were utterly terrible. She now gives a brief account of Baron Vordenberg. He lives on a small pension from the family's old estates and dedicates himself to studying vampire lore. He has volumes of studies, accounts, and legal cases, some of which he lends to Laura's father. She learns many things, like how vampires appear alive, both in their coffins and in the outside world. It's unknown how they escape and return to their graves. They're sustained by a renewing sleep there. Their thirst for blood feeds the vigor of their waking existence, and they never relent until they sate their passion and drain all life from their desired victim. In some cases, they act slowly, as if craving courtship, sympathy, and consent. Apparently, there are certain occasions in which the vampire is bound by some special condition. Mircalla seemed in some way tied to her name, which, even if not her birth name, had to be composed solely of the same letters. No more, no less. This is what we call an anagram. The Baron stays with them for a few weeks and reacts to Laura's father's account of the Moravian noble and the eradication of the vampire in Karnstein's church graveyard. He smiles and says he has diaries and notes about that man, a distant relative, apparently a passionate lover of Mircalla. His early death plunged him into deep grief. He knew vampirism sometimes began with suicide, and the vampire would then pursue the living, who, upon dying, would also become vampires. This happened to Mircalla, who was haunted by a demon. The noble knew this could happen to her and was consumed by horror at the thought of his beloved entering an existence more terrible than death itself. He pretended to remove her remains and erase her monument. Then in his old age, he was overcome with immense guilt and left notes that guided the Baron to that exact place. He wrote a confession and perhaps intended to act, but death overtook him first. Thus it was his descendant who carried out justice, though too late for some. The Baron adds that one sign of a vampire is the strength of their hands, as was clear when they closed with immense power over the generals. Afterward, they leave a numbness in the limbs, which may never fully recover. The following spring, Laura's father took her to Italy, and they stayed away for more than a year. The image of Carmilla returned to her mind with ambiguous alternations. Sometimes the playful, languid, and beautiful young woman. Other times the twisted demon she had seen in the ruined church. And horrifically, Laura confessed that she often woke from a daydream imagining she had heard Carmilla's light footsteps at the door of the room.